Hey everybody, I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about something that happened this weekend. I, as you may know, have a blog on Patheos called Messy Inspirations. Check it out if you haven't already. Messy Inspirations at Patheos. And this past weekend was the Sunday's Gospel was the parable of the talents, Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. And so I posted about that, going into the cultural context. Incidentally, in this Bible Alive YouTube channel, there is a whole playlist on the parables of Jesus talking about the 5 most difficult parables of Jesus. And the 5th parable we deal with at some length is the parable of the talents. It's been up since 2017. I invite you to go check it out, look into it. It goes into this far more detail. But anyway, in a condensed version of that, I presented in my Patheos blog a breakdown of Sunday's Gospel, Matthew chapter 25, 14 to 30, the parable of the talents. And apparently it was so disturbing to a number of readers, which is good, by the way, I offended so many people. I offended also a fellow blogger who decided to call me out on the Patheos Facebook page, claiming that I completely misunderstood and misrepresented the parable. And he next proceeded to present a very typical allegory gone wild treatment of the passage. If you go to my YouTube playlist on the parables, you'll see I talk a lot about allegory gone wild. I'm indebted to Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh of the Context Group of Biblical Scholars, who just masterfully shows that tendency in church history. The fathers that are Syriac, Western, Greek, they tend to allegorize wildly. And Jesus didn't tell allegories. But anyway, I'm getting away from that. This blogger was extremely offended because I referred to the master in the parable as a douche. He implied that I was saying that God was a douche. I didn't call God a douche. I called the master a douche because he was. The master is not God, but it's popularly understood that the master must represent God. Well, let me tell you something, folks. If the master in the parable of the talents represents God, who needs the devil? If the master in the parable of the talents, or the Lucan version of the coins, represents God, who needs the devil? Almost every Catholic I know would benefit from a solid course on Jesus' parables. So I encourage you to go through the lessons laid out in the playlist I just mentioned, particularly for the parable of the talents and the coins, and get a refresher there on the difference between parables and allegories. Because very few Catholics I know, very few Christians I know, can really distinguish and understand that parables are not allegories. And what the early church did, including the writers of Gospels, is turn Jesus' parables. Jesus didn't tell allegories. The evangelists turned the parables into allegories, and the allegorizing kept on going after the written Gospels. Anyway, I'm going to try to keep this video short and sweet. Again, I'm going to be following the insights of Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh here, Context Group Biblical Scholar. My fellow blogger, Sir Rejoinder, rests on his unproven presumption that the master who reaps where he did not sow and gathers where he scattered no seed is in fact God. So I'm going to try to keep my focus here on the master while touching on a few other elements. I know if you've been to any homily about this parable, I'm not psychic, but I can guarantee that the homilist almost assuredly identified the master with God. And this is a problem, because there's no textual support for that. To say that he's God is to say that this man must be honorable, because why would you describe God as an Israelite like Jesus? Why would you be describing God, the Father, as somebody dishonorable, somebody reprehensible, somebody a reprobate? But that's the problem, is that the master is a scumbag. So we have to ask the question, if we're going to call the master God, or an analog for God, we have to ask, what is the only possible way that the master could be viewed as honorable? And that such a parable as the parable of the talents, or in Luke, the parable of the coins, could be seen as good news, as gospel? Answer, only if the storyteller, Jesus, and his audience were wealthy and held the greedy rich vantage point and value system of greedy elites in the first century. Because only greedy elites would listen to that parable and deem that the master was a good man and that the parable is good news. Therefore, to estimate the master as righteous and honorable and the story as gospel, good news, demands that both storyteller and audience wield coercive force and use it to extract what rightfully belonged to peasants for themselves. Consequently, if this were so, Jesus the storyteller and his audience would be the very opposite of what the sage Ben Sira praises in Sirach chapter 31, verses 8 to 11. It's very ironic that Western interpreters, American Christians among them, including U.S. Catholics, overwhelmingly assume that the master is an honest person and that his actions in the parable are entirely justified. Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh wonders what could possibly bring gospel readers to this conclusion. Is it narrative logic that leads readers to assume that, nudging them along the way so that they will adopt this viewpoint of the master? Think of him positively? Dr. Rohrbaugh offers a far more likely scenario. Western acculturation does this. As Rohrbaugh and other context group scholars stress, Jesus is not an American. We've talked about this a lot on this YouTube channel. Rohrbaugh cautions us against any Jesus we might concoct in our heads who is congenial to American values. Therefore, we must also beware any and all gospels congenial to American cultural values also. So when I'm reading the gospels, right, I'm looking at a story I think I understand. Is it tickling my American ear? If so, it probably ain't the real Jesus. Because Jesus, the real Jesus, was a starving Galilean peasant artisan, speaking to mostly fellow starving Galilean peasants. And their world, folks, was a limited good world. Think of a pizza pie, and that's all there is. And there's only so much to go around. And if you come in as an a-hole, like this master, and the two so-called heroic, faithful servants, and you take a slice for yourself bigger than what you are owed, you are robbing from the rest. Because all the goods in the world were given at creation, they were distributed, and there is simply no more to come. That's the principle of the limited good. The world they have is a zero-sum game. You get something, somebody else had it taken from them. If it's extra, it's extra. You get something surplus to what you need, and what is your right, you have robbed from someone else. Therefore, Jesus and friends would view any master receiving 1,000%, that's what he gets in this story, 1,000% on his money, as despicably shameful and greedy. Ultimately, Jesus would call this guy a fool, like he does to the farmer in the Lucan story, Luke chapter 12, verse 16 to 21, who stores up all his surplus. Instead of being a patron and sharing the surplus with the needy, he stores it up, and then Jesus calls him a fool. And he is a fool. God takes his life. In Jesus' day, who could see this parable of the talents, Matthew 25, 14 to 30, or its variant, the parable of the coins, Luke chapter 19, verses 12 to 27, as good news? Who would say, oh, sure, it's obvious that the master is symbolically standing in for God. He's an analog for God. Look carefully at the master. He's ruthless. He's a shameless elite, guilty of usury. He lays out his money to the vile money lenders and agents who were not trusted in the first century world, folks. The scales were all rigged. He threatens and interrogates his slaves and scrutinizes the ledgers. This is a stand-in for the God of Israel? What a disrespectful way of portraying God. I mean, with such a God, who needs the devil? And how can this be the gospel or the good news? Would this be good news to peasants, to Jesus' peasant audience? 80 to 90% of his audience would be peasants, starving peasants. Many of them would have had their lands cheated from them in the kangaroo courts controlled by the elites and their retainers. Elites like this master. Is that the gospel? No, thank you. I don't want that gospel. If I'm a peasant in the first century, I don't need that gospel. Who needs such a wretched God and bad news like this? And then if you look at the supposed saints or holy men of the story, these would be slaves number 1 and 2, who take what the master gave him and double the money, and they make it more. How could Jesus or his peasant listeners ever think of these two reprobates as heroes? While they both may seem venturesome and industrious to us, go, do Americans, don't forget, these are characters from a Middle Eastern peasant story, and inspiration happens in folks. You have to ask yourself, how would Galilean peasants ardently believing in the limited good ever be convinced that these two were heroes or holy people? The only people who could see this sorry pair as heroes or saints would be wicked folks themselves. Admirers of these two slaves would believe it right to amass wealth by contriving to get a more extensive and therefore unjust share of the limited pie of goods, thereby stealing from the poor. In other words, only a first century a-hole, greedy SOB, like the master, would think these two characters righteous and honorable. And who in Jesus' day would imagine the poor third slave, the one who added nothing, the one who buried his talent in the ground, as wicked? Only people with a greedy elitist mentality. Certainly not peasants like Jesus and the majority of his audience. But go to any Western sermon or homily, any preacher or priest from the West, and you will hear nothing but condemnation of the third slave. The universal cry is, he's a failure. By the way, there's variations in this, and it's important to see the variations, because that suggests that the versions we are getting, even though we call them inspired, which is fine, have definitely been recontextualized and evolved from the version Jesus actually told somewhere in the Galilee, maybe the year 29. To Jesus and his fellow peasants in the year 29, the world was very different than ours. They believed that no human power could increase the size of the limited good pie. The world was given its goods, distributed evenly and justly by God in creation, and there's no more to come. If there's anything going to come, it's a renewal, not more pie. And they also thought that the rich, who did not share their surplus like stewards and patrons think the Godfather movies, were greedy thieves without mercy. They believed that an honorable man only sought out what was already his by right and no more. I want you to think about it, my friends. To a Galilean peasant, this parable would have been a tale of terror. How could they accept that it was a description of the kingdom of God? If that were so, then this parable would have confirmed the worst nightmares of Jesus' peasant audience. Because that would mean that God and his reign, the reign of God, the kingdom of God, worked precisely as did their daily experience. In other words, the powerful and the greedy take advantage and destroy the weak and get rewarded for it because God is no different. He's just like the rich, wealthy elites. American Catholics, please carefully examine the actions of the third slave. He buries his master's talent for safekeeping. According to peasants like Jesus and the vast majority of his listeners, this is precisely what an honorable person ought to do. Commenting on Exodus 22 verse 7, guess what the first century source Josephus Flavius says happens to a depositary should he lose the smallest portion of a deposit? That means he has to face a tribunal with 7 judges and swear oaths that he has neither used any of it nor lost it through any malice or intent. Going back to the story, what does the third slave do? He follows to the letter what would become later rabbinic law. He buries it in the ground. This is the proper honorable course of action. Rabbis would later rule that somebody bearing an entrusted amount was not responsible for any loss. So if it got lost, well, he buried it in the ground. It's like an act of God. He didn't do something with it dishonorable, like taking it to twisted markets and banks and commit the sin of usury to increase it. We have to not forget that the third slave acknowledges that he's very afraid. Luke says specifically, he's afraid of the master. Why? The master is said to be a very hard man. The Greek term in Matthew means harsh or cruel or merciless. In Luke, the term means strict or exacting. In either case, we get a picture of exactly the kind of greedy person described by the ancient Plutarch, one who constantly interrogates slaves and inspects the ledgers with an eye only for his own profit. Moreover, we are told that he reaps where he did not sow and gathers where he did not scatter seed. My friends, what could be a better description of a crook? This man is simply a thief, or in the biblical understanding, a greedy rich person who does not share his surplus. Folks, this evil master in the story isn't God. He's not an analog for God. He's just a greedy Mediterranean son of a bitch, the type that Plutarch describes. Someone who continually interrogates slaves, scrutinizes the ledgers, only with profit as his sole concern. This is a ruthless person. Folks, what language means shifts whenever language shifts its location. Words mean what they mean only where and when they are used. If you shift the location of the language, you necessarily and unescapably change the meaning. He hit it. You all can recognize that. You all can understand that. The sentence works. You all can read it. It registers. You all can understand the words in the syntax. It makes sense. But not one person in here can interpret it. Because you don't know who he is. And you don't know what hit means exactly. And you don't know what it is. Words in isolation don't convey meaning. Language scholars and ordinary people realize, for example, that the English word fire has a different meaning in each of the following sentences. A raging fire burned down our home. My favorite golden oldie is Light My Fire. My brother-in-law got fired last week. My dad fired up the engine and the boat headed out of the harbor. Through the darkness of future past, the magician longs to see. One chance out between two worlds. Fire, walk with me. These different meanings of the word fire, pretty simple word, derive from our culture, our social system. Without a knowledge of mainstream United States culture or social system, a foreigner assigned to translate these sentences into another language wouldn't gain much assistance by only referring to an English dictionary alone. The same would be true of any believer trying to read the Bible in the original languages of Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, thinking that all he needs is a concordance or interlinear with the original vocabulary. Right? Take the English word hot. What does it mean? Seems pretty simple. We use it all the time. If you're in the Sahara Desert, hot is a reference to temperature. But if you're on the basketball court and you say of another player, wow, he's hot, you're referring to his scoring. Okay, let's say you're out at the beach and you see a hot girl. It means you find her sexually attractive. See the difference? So what does hot mean? Well, it depends on the context. It's hot. He's hot. She's hot. Hot Wheels. Hot race. Hot under the collar. Hot goods. Hot stuff. Hot deal. What does hot mean? Every time you move the word hot, you necessarily change its meaning. Someone once figured out, I guess he had a lot of time on his hands, that the English word get has 57 meanings. Can you imagine that? Think about it. I don't get it. Get lost. Man, that gets me. Get with a freaking program. And on and on. The context in which we use language changes the meaning of that language rather sharply. Consider the sentence, he went to the bank. Do we all understand that? That's pretty easy to understand, right? He went to the bank. What does that mean, though? What's the meaning of that sentence? Well, look, it depends on the context. If he's downtown in a major American city or Western city, if he is downtown in such a city, it probably means that he went to a financial institution. But what if he is on the Madison River and he's fishing up in Montana? He went to the bank, then probably means he has waded out to the stream, but now has retreated back toward the shore. We're talking English, folks. We haven't yet talked to Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic 2,000 years ago. Folks, whether it's words or sentences, language only means what it means, where and when you use it. This causes us very big problems when we start talking about the sayings of the Middle Eastern day laborer and folkular Jesus, Son of God or no, including his parables. We have a context problem, don't we? Think about it this way. At some point in time, late 20s Common Era in Syro-Palestine, there we discover the context of the pre-Paschal Jesus himself. Folks, pre-Paschal means Jesus prior to the passion, death, and resurrection. Okay? He's alive. He's walking around, talking in villages of Galilee, and people are listening to him. They're being healed by him in a certain context around 2,000 years ago, in a very alien culture than ours. After Jesus' death and resurrection, there is another time, another period of time, where other people talk about Jesus, talking about stuff and doing stuff. Every one of these people in this other time is either recounting memories or hearsay, and they're doing it in a new and different context. Think about this. If I said things to you and did things to you, then I died and somehow was revealed to you as Cosmic Lord, and you remembered back what I said way back when, wouldn't you have to recontextualize and resituate and reevaluate everything I said and did that you remember? Because before you didn't know I was Lord. Now I'm the Cosmic Lord. That's going to change things, right? And when you retell them, that's going to affect that new understanding of me. Because before you didn't know I was Lord. Now I'm the Cosmic Lord. That's going to change things, right? And when you retell them, that's going to affect that new understanding of me, reshape what I said before. As this spreads, folks, throughout a region, it diversifies. Contexts multiply left and right. And the result of this is the meaning of the spoken parables of Jesus necessarily is changing. Again, according to the Second Vatican Council's Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, Dei Verbum, number 19, the Pontifical Biblical Commission's Instruction on the Historical Truth of the Gospels, sections 6 through 9, and the Universal Catechism, Catholic tradition, I know we have non-Catholics here, the Catholic Church officially teaches the only way we can understand this primary source for understanding Jesus, the four Gospels, is understanding the Gospels developmentally. That they developed, that they evolved. They weren't dictated by God.
How do we actually know when the Gospels were written? With difficulty. But it is not impossible. First off, all mythicists are non-scholarly and wrong. Jesus existed. We can infer that from two bedrock facts about him. 1, he was crucified. 2, shortly after his death by crucifixion, Jesus was proclaimed risen by his followers. Elaborating on these two bedrock facts, we can discover that Jesus died sometime on or around 30 Common Era. From that, we can determine also that the Gospels must have been written after 30 Common Era. Omitting probable earlier allusions, the earliest, most convincing quotations of the Gospels are found in the writings of Justin Martyr, around 150 Common Era. Justin refers to certain documents he quotes from as the Memoirs of the Apostles. He never calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but we can see that his quotations correspond beautifully with the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In at least two places, Justin Martyr alludes to John, indicating that he knows that text also. Going by this, the Gospels could not have been written after 150 Common Era or before 30 Common Era. So we have a window of 120 years. That's quite a window. Can we narrow it further? Well, we can narrow it further. If it is true that the Gospels are based on oral traditions that had been in circulation about Jesus, not just in Palestine, where Aramaic was the spoken language, but also outside of Palestine, in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world, the language the Gospels were written in, then that must have taken some time. Second-wave Judean followers of Jesus surely had information about Jesus' words. For example, the tradition common to both Matthew and Luke called Q, sayings now found in the so-called Gospel of Thomas, perhaps a collection of Jesus' parables. Not only Jesus' words would have been collected, but also his wondrous deeds. For example, a collection of anecdotes about Jesus' marvels. This information was largely in the form of memorized verbal lists, either to be cherished as a keepsake from the first wave, still largely in control of Judean and Galilean Jesus groups, or ignored as irrelevant in the light of second-wave reinterpretations and recontextualizations triggered by Jesus group experience outside of Judea and Galilee. Looking closely at the second-wave Jesus groups, we encounter Paul and his clients. Paul wrote his 7 authentic letters, which make up the earliest New Testament literature, in the 50s Common Era, and he was dead by the mid-60s. Paul traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean and established a number of Jesus groups composed of Hellene or civilized Israelite emigres in major urban centers. Shockingly, Paul almost never quotes Jesus. He simply isn't interested in Jesus' sayings or mighty deeds. Importantly for our purpose here, Paul gives no indication that he had ever heard that there were Gospels about Jesus. Could it be that Paul knew about these Gospels, but just chose to ignore them in his letters? This is very unlikely, for several reasons. A major one is discussed in the companion video to this presentation. Gospels are for grandchildren. You should really watch it after this video. So with all this understood, please forget about the Gospels being composed in the months following Jesus' death and resurrection. It was almost certainly decades after. Since the Gospels were likely unknown in the 50s, when Paul was active, our window narrows to no earlier than 60 Common Era. Except for non-scholarly conservative Catholics and other Christians, basically fundamentalists of various stripes, the document we call Mark was likely the first canonical Gospel written, and is a third-wave Jesus group composition. But when exactly was Mark written? Was it composed before or after the Judean war with Rome, culminating in the destruction of the temple urban center Jerusalem in 70 Common Era? Likely, Mark was written afterward. Why? Well, look at the comments in Mark chapter 13 about how the temple will be destroyed. Does this indicate that Mark lived after the fact? Maybe. Mark is vague about the temple's destruction. Or It could be that his descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem were left vague because he's writing from somewhere way outside Palestine and has only heard rumors of what happened there. Matthew and the earliest version of John were third-wave documents, written after Mark. The final version of John, with its appended chapter 21, was composed after its Jesus group had become an anti-society, sometime around 100 Common Era, in the fourth wave. The document we call Luke also was a fourth wave document. There is no convincing argument that claims John knew about the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But Matthew and Luke knew Mark for sure, even if they never read each other's respective texts. Both these synoptic gospels were dependent on Mark for many of their stories, and so they must have been written later, after Mark. How much later? Again, the companion video to this one, The Gospels Are for Grandchildren, helps clarify matters. Additionally, we can say that it is pretty clear that the documents we call Matthew and Luke were written after 70 Common Era. Both of these documents refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. All four canonical Gospels were evidently composed sometime between 70 Common Era and 150 Common Era. Why do so many scholars claim that they were all composed between 70 and 100 Common Era, a mere 30 years? It is because of possible allusions to them found in extra-biblical works like the Didache, written around 100 Common Era. One could also cite the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, but that would assume that Ignatius wrote his letters around 110. There are convincing arguments that the figure known as Ignatius actually lived and wrote decades after this. Short and sweet, there is a great deal of complicated arguing going on even now. One more thing about John. In its final anti-language form with chapter 21 attached, it certainly appears to be the final gospel written. Could it come from the early 2nd century? Maybe. But many scholars are convinced that the highly edited version of John we have in our Bibles was written sometime in the 90s. The reason is because it belongs to an anti-society reeling in bitterness from the Judean rejection of the gospel, easily located in time, and this gospel does not address later docetic controversies about Jesus, as does Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, this later version of John comes after the Synoptics, but before Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, it was probably written near the close of the 1st century. Now, all of these are scholarly guesstimations. They're all probability judgments. They are all reasonable, but not exact or precise. The Gospels themselves, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, emerged through a 3-stage evolutionary process. Stage 1, the original words and deeds of the pre-paschal Jesus. Stage 2, after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the light of Easter, the apostles saw Jesus now as cosmic Lord and Messiah, and now they proclaimed him through catechesis, through narratives, through testimonia, through hymns, through doxologies, hymns of praise, and prayers as such. Stage 3 is the most neglected and yet most important stage. It's the stage of the communities of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and which produced the documents we call by those names. This, according to our, at least Catholic tradition, respectful of everybody here, our Catholic tradition, that's what we teach. So to break down the 3 stages of gospel evolution, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. The official church teaching in the Catholic tradition among Christians is you will never understand these Gospels
unless you understand them developmentally. Moving right along. Here's another way of looking at it. So if I take all the literature of the New Testament, I could see that there are 4 waves of Jesus groups which produce different materials with different focuses. The first wave would be the Jesus movement prior to his death and resurrection. The second wave would be groups like Paul forming second wave, sometimes called second generation. That would be when he's writing. The third wave would be the earliest narrative gospels, Mark, Matthew, John in an early form, 2 Thessalonians, Revelation. Fourth wave would be like Luke and Acts, Timothy, Colossians, the pastoral epistles. You notice how on the bottom tier, as you go from left to right, you're moving ahead, forward in time, from 30 Common Era to 100 Common Era and beyond. You notice how the theological focus shifts. That necessarily changes the meaning. Don't you think that's important that we get that when we're reading that material? What do you think? None of the gospel writers of Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John ever met the pre-Paschal Jesus or heard from him his parables. Mark and Matthew stand third wave, third generation down the line after the pre-Paschal Jesus. Luke is the fourth wave, fourth generation. Mark is writing in either Syria, maybe Rome, definitely not the Galilee, where Jesus preached and healed, and he's writing 40 years after the lifetime of the pre-Paschal Jesus. Matthew is probably writing from Antioch in Asia Minor, 50 plus years after the lifetime of Jesus, present-day Turkey. Luke is a fourth wave, fourth generation document after the pre-Paschal Jesus. Luke is writing from some large Greco-Roman city, possibly Athens, maybe Corinth, somewhere in what we now call Europe, some 50 to 60 years after the lifetime of Jesus. Understand what has happened, folks. Stories of Jesus, whatever they might have actually meant in their original context in which they were originally told, are now vibrating all over the Mediterranean world in new and different contexts. The result of this is the meaning of the stories were inevitably changed. Finally, we get to our culture. These stories arrive into our time and situation, that of 21st century American readers. These stories were not told for, by, or about Americans. Can we make use of them? What do you say, class? You guys are so optimistic. I like that. You know what I say? Maybe. Maybe. And if so, only with Herculean effort. Because our context by which we would use these stories is so radically different and alien than the original context in which these were told, causes for us innumerable and serious problems. We have to be very careful in attempting to understand these stories in their literal sense. What they meant originally to their authors and to their audiences. Let me give you a sobering fact. We do not know the historical or geographical context of a single parable of Jesus. I want you to consider the parable of the great banquet for a moment. Jesus loved to talk about the great banquet, right? Matthew turns that great banquet into a wedding banquet. Luke turns it into the banquet at a rich man's home. Folks, that's very different. Is it a wedding feast or is it a rich man's party? The apocryphal sayings gospel of Thomas, not in our canon, not in our New Testament, has this story also. He gives it no context. It's just, and Jesus said, because it's a collection of sayings, and then the story follows. Folks, when you find 3 different writers using the same Jesus story, each in a different context, you could safely bet that by the time that they are writing this story down, we are far removed from the Galilean villages in 29 CE. However, here is another critically important fact. All of the parables have the socio-cultural world of first century Israel as their context. They were all written by people from the Mediterranean world of 2,000 years ago. Not by, for, or about Americans. So the best that we 21st century Western Bible readers can do when we are trying to understand their literal sense is, 1, recognize that these stories are not and cannot be American. 2, recognize that they are Middle Eastern. And 3, to the extent that we can at least recreate the general context of that life back then in that first century world, know this, that to that degree and to that extent, we can have at least some confidence that we are hearing these stories the way that the original hearers might have understood them. We are Catholic and other Christians here, and we believe in the inspiration of the Bible. Amen. Well, to believe in that, you have to take the in inspiration seriously. We are Christians, and we believe in the incarnation, that God became human. Amen? All right. Well, then we have to take the in of incarnation very seriously. Into what? American lives? 21st century scientific people, or first century Middle East? What is a parable? We use the word, rolls right off the tongue, parable of Jesus. Parables are metaphors or similes drawn from nature or common life, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes with a little hyperbole to catch attention. Usually parables are stories that are told to express one big punchline point. However, the early Jesus groups of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries did not understand that very well. They didn't get what parables were. What they tended to do was, folks, our ancient ancestors in the faith, was take all of the details of the story and make every little detail in the story symbolic of something else. In other words, they turned the parables of Jesus into allegories. Let me see if I can show you what that means with an extreme example of that. St. Augustine prayed for us. Now we're in the 5th century, right? St. Augustine of Hippo. Take his understanding of the parable of the Good Samaritan. I don't have to explain the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's one of the most easy to understand. I mean, that parable, everybody knows it, right? We've heard it many times. The parable of the Good Samaritan, okay. Let's look at Augustine's understanding of it. The parable of the Good Samaritan originally was about an Israelite who gets, roughed up, brutally robbed, and badly injured by his assailants. Okay. But Augustine, when he reads it, decides that every single detail in that story has to have some secret, cryptic, symbolic meaning. And so he comments on it thus. Now, what you see in italics there, that's the actual parable, and what you see in bold is Augustine's interpolated commentary. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace, from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon. It does? Where's he getting that from? And signifies our mortality, because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels. They are. Who stripped him, namely of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead. Because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives. But insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. He is therefore called half dead. You see what Augustine's done? He went through that whole parable, and with every single word in it, he assigted some cryptic and symbolic meaning. In other words, what Augustine has done is turned a parable of Jesus, a metaphorical story, into an allegory. Scholars like Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh are convinced that not a single parable of Jesus originally was an allegory. Jesus didn't tell allegories. He told parables. Almost every scholar agrees Jesus never told allegorical stories. Turning them all into allegories was the result of people living far removed from the original context, clueless about the meaning of these stories, and so they cooked up some pretty fancy and often fantastical stuff.